This is Talking Hardcore, the podcast for people who love hardcore history.
You study history because it allows us to understand the present and prepare for the future.
I'm not trolling.
And I love it.
I'm just pointing out where they're wrong.
The Talking Hardcore podcast is presented by Ace Industrial Solutions. Are you in need of skilled trade professionals for your next project? Look no further.
As we said, I'm George. This is Scott. We're here today with Daniele Bolelli. Okay, History on Fire podcast. Also a history professor, a martial artist, anything else? Oh, an author. You have nonfiction, and aren't you working on a fiction book as well?
Yeah, I am. And, given that how
That's
the
cool.
publishing industry is, it's kind of a difficult gig in the sense that, the people who see you as a fiction author, as a non-fiction author, don't really care to see you as a fiction author, and vice versa. So they are completely different people who handle fiction and non-fiction. So it's kind of like starting from scratch, but,
Right.
we'll see what I can do with it.
Maybe you should talk to the people at The Rest is History, like Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. I know Dan's been on their podcast a few times too, because Tom Holland started as a fiction author and then he's a historian as well and writes history books. And Mr. Sandbrook also writes kids historical books that are based for kids. But like he did one on the Aztecs and stuff. He did one that's Aztecs, the fall of the Aztec Empire, but for children. I was like,
how are you going to do that? That's the mystery of life.
And he doesn't pull his punches because in the podcast episode, he's talking about it. And he's like, yeah, that's in the book. And I'm like, man,
Wow.
my 10-year-olds would be like freaking out having nightmares for this. But like, I think a 10-year-old boy would probably be like, hell yeah, cool. This is pretty sweet, right? Sword fights, all kinds of crazy stuff. But maybe talking to them would be a good idea to find people who can help you get people to see you in both lights.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Anyway,
that's a good tip. I agree.
Cool. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I grew up in Italy. I moved to US when I was 18 to go to college out here. I wasn't really planning on teaching or anything like that. I kind of stumbled on it on the way, and so I ended up getting my degrees were in American Indian Studies and in history. And then I started teaching history classes around, and that's how I started making my living. I also wrote, as you said, 4 nonfiction books. And then I think when it was, it was because of one of these books that back in 2011, I got invited to a couple of huge podcasts in kind of a way. I mean, the way it worked out was really weird. Like, it really should have never worked that way by logic. And it was sort of like winning the lottery 7 times in a row, because due to one of these books, I get this message that say, oh, we booked you on a couple of podcasts, Adam Carolla and Joe Rogan. And, this is 2011. I don't even know what podcasts are. So I'm just like, sure, cool. Right. I know Rogan is, I know Carolla. I'll go and chat, whatever, And I remember going there, and when Rogan wasn't there yet, there was this, the person like Brian Redban, who was handling the whole thing for Rogan. And so I asked him, he's like, I have a vague idea of what we're doing here, but like podcasting, what exactly? And he was like, oh, it's just like radio, but you can cuss. And I was like, okay, I think I got it. That makes sense. I can do that. And then, I didn't know just how big of a medium it was, even back then, which is, of course, a fraction of what it is today. And I spent like the next 3 days after being on Rogan's podcast just answering people's emails of people who were reaching out and messaging. And I was like, whoa, this thing is huge. I did not know that. And then, over time, over a period of the next few months, other people started inviting me over their podcast and so on. And so I got a lot of people beginning to ask me, why don't you start your own podcast? And that was the last thing on my mind, because I'm like, man, I'm already so busy between teaching and trying to write and, raising my daughter. I had like 7 million things on my plate. I was like, there's no way. So at one point, just to get people off my back, I said, yeah, sure, if all I have to do is just produce content and somebody else worries about editing and finding, putting it up on the web and getting it to all the, sure, if I don't need to learn anything, I can talk. That's not a problem. And I kind of said it as a way to get people off my back. Within 5 minutes, I had Rich Evers sending me this message saying, hey, I'm a film editor in Culver City. I would help you with editing. And other friend, Evan, wrote, oh, I can put up the website for you. I was like, damn, I put myself in a corner. Now I have to podcast. And so I started out with a podcast that was more like Rogan, more like chatty interviews, that kind of thing. And then after a while, I started thinking, okay, well, I teach history for a living. I'm already podcasting. My favorite podcast is probably Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I put 2 and 2 together and realized, you know what? That would actually be a fun thing to do for all the 3 zillion history books I've read that are not the stuff that I teach all the time. Let's suddenly find use for it. Let's turn it into a podcast. Which, of course, I did not quite anticipate how much work a history podcast like the long form that I do is, because, I have to read an ungodly amount of books on a topic before I can release an episode. So when you add up all the reading a ton of books and taking notes and then putting them together in a cohesive manner, and now try to make it just not a bunch of facts, but make it interesting and engaging, it's a long process to go from zero to getting an episode out. It's many, 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 many hours of work. But of course, it also became fun, and it became the one thing that I ever did that was probably the most successful. So I was like, okay, it's a lot of work, but let's play with it.
Right. And that's how you ended up getting to meet Dan Carlin. I think I heard you tell that story before, where you were on Joe Rogan when you met him, didn't you? Isn't that how that went?
Yeah, that was actually a funny one. It was, I did not have my own pod. I didn't have History on Fire yet, but I do remember, I think I messaged Dan a couple of times, and Dan, being a gentleman, replied and was very sweet and nice about the whole thing. I forget if he had already been like in a remote format as a Zoom guest on my other podcast or not, or if this was soon thereafter. But yeah, I'm hanging out at home and I got this text from Rogan saying, hey, you want to hop on a podcast in 2 hours with Dan Carlin? And I'm like, sure. So I kind of dropped whatever I was doing, drove out, met with Dan. And,
Right.
So I knew that episode was really was an episode that was supposed to just be Joe and Dan. So when I went, I was like, trying to really keep a low profile and let the two of them get most of the talking. I was just happy to get to meet Dan and just hop in, but I didn't want to, too forcefully interject myself into center stage. And Dan was just as nice in person as are my interactions with him previously. And Dan is really just one of those fantastic, sweet, good human beings who refreshing to run into, because he's just such a good person. He's just amazing. And I mean, even think about it, like what I do with History on Fire, if he wanted to, he could see that as competition. He could see that as something that I'm stepping on his turf. And instead, he has been nothing but supportive. He had me on his Hardcore History Addendum a couple of times. He
and that's where I found you.
Me.
That's where I started listening to your podcast.
Right, exactly. No, that Dan is just an absolute gem of a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Like in terms of, he's really one of my favorite people. He's just such a good person. Not only he's a master storyteller, but he's just, if at all possible, because he's so good at storytelling, he's even better just as a person.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, we interacted with him, and when we interviewed him, and yeah, it's the same thing. Like, he has no reason to be generous with his time with us, but he just is. That's you could just tell. And it's like you coming on here, podcasting. That's what's great. It could be competitive, but it doesn't need to be. There's people who like history content are not going to not listen to yours because they not listen to Dan's because they found yours.
Yeah.
Right. They just listen to both. That's the beauty of it, right? When you have an audience, right? It's not like you have to be generic. Like it used to be before podcasting, right? You couldn't have a history show like this where you had to appeal to a huge audience because you didn't have a market to find that big audience. Now people can find you, right? And so you can find your niche and they can find you, which is really just the coolest thing about the internet. Okay.
Yeah,
so that's the background to how you started doing podcasts.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
so now we've got some fun questions we thought would be. Are we getting a delay
we'll
again?
do, I guess, because we have a 4-second delay in the audio, we'll do like gestures when I'll jump in and I'll let you know that I'm about to. That way we'll. Otherwise we're totally like off sync on the audio. But I guess what I was saying on the podcasting thing was like I saw some statistics that there are some 3.5 million podcasts out there in the world. But the funny thing is that the overwhelming majority, something like 2.5 million of these podcasts, literally have their mom listening or something. It's just like they have 5 people listening. So, like for a podcast to even, if you have any kind of an audience, if you just have like friends and family, you're already in the top third right there. And it's interesting how much the medium has spread.
Right. Well, I saw your tweet and your Facebook post yesterday. Congratulations, by the way. Top 0.05% of all podcasts, History on Fire is.
That's awesome.
Right? Isn't that what you said? It was really high up there. That's awesome, man. Congratulations.
It
shows the hard work.
I think it was like I got lost with the zeros, but I think it was 0.05, something ridiculous. Basically, out of 3.5 million podcasts, it was in the top 1,000 or something, which is like, okay, that's cool. It's reaching people. It's nice. And because that's the funny thing about podcasting sometimes is that you don't see your audience. So sometimes you see numbers, which may or may not be accurate, but you really sometimes don't know who you are reaching, how much of an impact it is or is not having. So it's always cool sometimes when you get emails or something. You're like, oh, people actually listen. People actually think about it. This is cool.
Yeah, you get feedback. You don't get enough feedback otherwise. I can see how that could happen. One thing I love about your podcast is the music that you have for your intro. It sounds like an Old West movie. Is that from an Old West movie? I thought it was. I'm like, it's sweet. It's like listening. I expect Clint Eastwood to walk out and shoot somebody when I'm listening to your podcast. It's so cool. And then I love the sound effects of the History on Fire. Let's set history. Can you give me one? Just say it with your accent. Say, let's go set history on fire. Can you say that for me?
History on
I like
fire.
The way it sounds. See, it sounds sweet with his accent. If I'd have said that with no accent, well, I guess I have an accent, but I don't think I have an accent. If I'd have said it with my no accent, it wouldn't have sounded as cool. Yeah. But all right, that's great. That is very interesting stuff. Thanks for giving us that rundown of your background. And I agree with you about podcasting. It's cool. But now Scott had a fun question that we wanted to run past you. Go ahead, Scott.
So, I listened to your 2-part podcast about Miyamoto Musashi. I think so did George as well. And that's where we heard the whole parading in front of Dan's house.
Yeah, which I'm still encouraging you to do.
100%.
If you don't know, in the podcast, go check it out. History on Fire, episode 102. The samurai in question was basically walking around telling everybody he was the number one best samurai in the world. And Daniele said that would be like if he went in front of Dan Carlin's house with a poster that says #1 history podcaster and just started parading around in front of him. And I immediately said, that's what he should do. I'll fly out there and film it for you. I think that's a great idea.
Have a podcast duel?
Yeah.
That's even better.
Oh,
just have a history duel.
This only gets funner, right? You start making viral content like that would be cool. Like he's talking shit to Dan, and then Dan's talking shit back. And then we could have a fake feud, And that'll drive up everybody's listeners?
I don't think you need to do that.
No, you don't need to.
Anyway,
But it'd be funny. It would troll everybody.
So anyway, listening to that podcast, the one thing that okay, so I have one question from that podcast. Hold on, I'll get to that one, George.
Okay.
The one question I had was, do you know why during Miyamoto Musashi's time, the samurai were getting away from armor, and then that's why Musashi used two swords? I mean, can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Basically, it was a time when there were no more battles. The Japan, after a period of long period of civil war, Japan got unified under the Tokugawa family. So all this fighting that took place for centuries, where the primary thing is you go into the battlefields in full armor, fighting against a whole bunch of other people, that was no longer the case because Japan was sort of forcibly pacified under the rule of the Tokugawa. As a result, nobody's going around in armor because you're not fighting actual battles anymore. The majority of the fighting that would take place as a street fight, not as a battle. And so as a street fight, again, nobody's parading through the streets of their town in full armor. They are going to be with no armor and just their side sword or something, which, by the way, wouldn't even be the prime. You know, we all love swords. They are cool. They look amazing, but they were really not the prime weapon for the samurai before that. Primarily, these guys were bow and arrows to shoot from a distance. They were spear, were playing a huge role. And then even at that time, his guns started coming into the picture as an element of warfare. Some of the first guns that the Portuguese brought over. So the sword was like everything else has gone wrong and you're down to your sword kind of thing. But of course, that's when real warfare was happening. Now that it was no real warfare, was more duels and street fighting, that's when the swords became a much bigger deal and no armor.
Gotcha.
Okay.
And that was fascinating. Now, but since you bring up the spear, I had to ask, or one picture came into my mind is, who would win? If you had, I don't know, let's say 100 hoplites, 100 Greek hoplites against 100, fully armored samurai. Like, what would that look like, and who do you think would?
Or one hoplite versus one samurai.
That'll work too.
Like both. I'm curious there because they never really fought. So
I guess depending on the samurai, what's their deal? Is a samurai in armor with a spear? Okay, then similar to a hoplite. Then it becomes who's more skilled. Are we talking about a samurai who's running around on horseback and the hoplite is chasing him in the sun and the samurai just laughs and makes fun of him and once in a while shoot an arrow at him? That's, of course, is a different outcome. If it's a samurai with no armor and a sword, he's probably screwed. He would lose. So I think it would depend on what conditions.
The spear would be better than the sword?
Definitely, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's interesting.
I guess in my mind I was picturing, 50-foot soldiers from both sides. So you had 50 hoplites square off with 50 samurai with their swords. No bows and arrows at this point. It's either spears and swords or however they're just going at it.
Kind of comes down to just tactics and
who's the better trained, but
high ground
but see,
and things like that.
Hoplites weren't that well trained.
Right.
I mean,
they weren't samurai. That's for sure. Yeah. Huh.
And even
that's interesting anyway.
Even the samurai army were tricky because sometimes, you had the super well-trained guys and then you had a bunch of like the foot soldiers, which were more or less peasants recruited from a campaign and they give you a spear and put some armor and say, put the pointy end into the other guy. And they're not necessarily super well-trained. So there was a bit of a gray zone between the social classes, whereas later it became more rigidly separate. During times of war, you get who you can get on a battlefield. So there was more room for social mobility. There was more room for somebody who's not born a samurai to become a big deal, and so on and so forth.
Sure. one of the things that I like about your podcast that compared to other history podcasts that kind of sets it aside, makes it different, is you seem to focus more of your episodes on individuals instead of like big sweeping historical things. And I thought that was fun. And so a lot of them tend to be individuals that also happen to be warriors and things like that. So I wanted to know, who is your favorite historical warrior?
Let's see. Probably, I think the story of Crazy Horse is just larger than life and really badass, even because it happened late in history. You know, when you go back 1,000 years, it's such a different world that is sometimes hard to relate in the same way. Crazy Horse died in 1877. It's not even, it's really not that long ago.
Right.
So the story of
Sure.
this guy who grew up in this culture that was, he grew up fully within a nomadic horseman Lakota culture in the US in the latter part of the 1800s, a culture that clearly was about to disappear in the face of the onslaught of the United States really quickly. And, everything about Crazy Horse
Right.
life is very much, it reads like a fantastic Shakespearean tragedy. It's both beautiful and heartbreaking. The guy had tremendous courage and toughness, but also keeps seeing all the people he cares about dying next to him. It's a really incredible story. And in fact, that's like the first long series that I've done, where that one actually, I originally thought I'll do one episode of Crazy Horse. Then I'm like, okay, I know a little too much on this. It's going to be 2 episodes. Make it 3. Okay, 4, fine.
Right.
And, it became this 4-part series where I go on for 8 hours by the end of it, because there is that much to say about the guy's life, his times. It's not 8 hours with too much that time. There's plenty of stuff that happened in his life that's highly dramatic.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, and that actually ties into something we're doing, a book club, live Discord book club on and Dan actually recommended this in the podcast we did with him on the book called Inda. I don't know how you say it, by Eve Ball. That's about Ace Douglaki and the Apaches, right? And so we're actually doing a live event where we're going to discuss that on the Discord channel. If you're bored and you want to come in, I'm sure you've probably read that book. It would be cool if you wanted to come on there. But I'll send you a link. But it's going to be. I mean, I'm just partway into it, and it's already fascinating. That area, or that era, the end of the Native Americans, as their wars with America, which is just, it's tragic. It's crazy because it's like a Greek epic, but 100 years ago. Like, they weren't even that far from electricity when this stuff was ending. You know, like, just absolutely crazy. And I find that, and it's funny because when I wrote that question about your favorite warrior, it never occurred to me you pick a Native American. I was thinking, a samurai or a knight. But what a great one! What a Crazy Horse is a great one. All right, and so this might be the same answer. Then I was going to ask you, who's your favorite historical figure, right? And that might be the same answer.
It's not. So for that, I go a different route, and
cool.
I think because you
awesome,
you put the finger on the fact that so many stories that we end up covering in history are things that have to do with fighting and wars and this and that, and after a while, it gets a little. It's like, come on, can I get into the story of somebody who is not primarily renowned for murdering people? Can we do something else for a change? And it's like, because sometimes so much of the history books focus on what's essentially the history of warfare that is refreshing when we end up looking at something different. And so I did this 2-part series. I think it was episode, I want to say 45, 46, or right around there. I did this 2-part series on this Zen monk from the 1400s named EQ. And EQ has the wildest, he's just a. Okay, let me see how can I sum up EQ quickly. But EQ's story is just, he really is my favorite historical character because he grows up in very tough environment. He was the legitimate son of the Emperor of Japan. His father did not acknowledge him for the longest time. His mom had to put him in a monastery to let him be raised by monks. So, he grows up in a fairly severe environment. He grows up at a time too, like during his lifetime is when the major period of the civil war that will finish with the Tokugawa and Musashi begins in the 1400s. He sees Kyoto burned to the ground, 100,000 people starving because of warfare. So the context is brutal. However, EQ find a way to have an absolute lasting life. He's an hilariously funny guy. He's brilliant in his understanding of Zen, and precisely because he loves Zen, he hates the Zen establishment. He thinks that the Zen establishment is mainly pandering to the wealthy for money and donation, but completely lost to what Zen was supposed to be about. He's really a comedian. Like, some of his things are so incredibly funny, and he has this rebel streak that's hilarious to contemplate. His main priorities in life, in no particular order, beside the Zen, are women and drinking. Those are some of the things that he seemed to be enjoying the most. And
that's funny, because you wouldn't think that would go along with Zen
or being a monk,
right?
Well,
you
and I
wouldn't
think that's
that,
his thing.
but that's interesting. I'm gonna listen to that episode.
And that's his thing, right? He argues, look, what Zen is about presence and a certain degree of consciousness that you carry in everyday life. It's not about putting on a show of being sacred and holy, when really you end up doing a bunch of stuff behind the back, behind like what you're not supposed. It's like, just embrace who you really are. Just so his attitude is, if the so-called profane things, if lived with a certain attitude, can be, there's no separation between the sacred and the profane. And of course, in the process of making an actual serious theological point, he does so in a way that's absolutely hilarious. And so it's
awesome.
in a way, it's like a high comedic talent set in Japan in the 1400s, in the middle of all this drama going on. And the funny thing about EQ is that beside managing
I'm gonna listen to that.
Yeah, no, it's great. And beside managing to have a great life, he also manages to has a huge impact on the culture of Japan, because so many of the people who followed him then became masters of tea ceremony, theater, painting, and they were some of the key artistic figures that revolutionized Japanese cultural life. So it's like, doesn't get any better than that. The guy manages to have an amazing life and have a big impact on history and people. Everybody loves him. He's hilariously funny. Really doesn't get much better than that.
Sounds good. Okay, so you said that episode's like in the 40s of your series.
Yeah.
So you did that a few years ago. I'm going to go find those, and I'm going to listen to that today. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. That reminds me, though, I believe you talk about this on your podcast. You're doing a trip to Japan this summer with a group of people. Like, they can sign up to go and tour Japan with you. Yeah. When I heard that, I'm like, what a good idea. Like, I mean, that is such a neat idea that people could do that. That's cool. So that you're going in June, or is that when it is, or sometime in the summer?
End of April, actually. It's going to be end of April and early May.
Oh, cool.
So that's coming up actually kind of soon. But I'm excited. I've never been to Japan, so it's going to be my first time. I get to discover it along with people, and it's going to be fun. I look forward to that.
That is such a cool idea.
That sounds awesome.
I know.
I mean, one place I haven't made it to yet.
No, Japan would be cool. That's on the list of places that I would love to go. Right. Okay. So I was watching your YouTube channel the other day, and you had an interesting one that was 5 dinners, or was it 5 dangerous dinners? In some of the pretty famous ones. But it made me think of a question to ask you then, based on that. So, do you have a favorite or a weird historical event that you don't think people really know about much, that is interesting, that you would want to talk about right now? Like when the Mongols ate dinner on top of the nobles That's a pretty great one. But do you have anything else like that you find interesting that you'd want to talk about?
Normally I like, as you said, I like the specific stories, the story of the one guy, the one event. I like to go very specific because it's easier to relate to. But the answer that comes up now when you ask this question is sort of a bigger story. It's the story that I cover. I covered it a while back, but it was behind the paywall. I just released those episodes. I just finished that series recently, the Taiping Rebellion, because it's one of those unknown aspects of history, particularly outside of China. Because, if you ask people what's the deadliest conflict in history, people will probably know it was World War II. But if you start asking for the second one, it's like, I don't know, maybe World War One, maybe. And so to find out what happened in China in the mid-1800s as a result of this rebellion, which in itself is a big deal because, some 20 million people were killed during this massive, massive historical event. But the thing that's most interesting to me is how it all starts with one guy losing his mind. You have this one guy who's taking the imperial exams in China, which are kind of your entry level to get any kind of high-end government job. And the failure rate is 99%, right? So they are super stressful things where very few people squeeze through. And so this whole village put their resources into this one promising boy, and he studies, goes to take the imperial exam, fails. Next year, same story. Then he does it a third time. When he's about to take it the third time, some Christian missionary hands him a pamphlet about Jesus and the Bible, this and that. The guy doesn't think much about it, goes to do the third exam, fails again, has a complete nervous breakdown. He starts hallucinating and being delirious for like weeks at a time because he really lost his mind due to the stress and of the whole thing. By the time he comes out of it, he starts putting together elements from the Christian pamphlets he read with his weird nervous breakdown. And he starts out, oh, you know what? I didn't have a nervous breakdown. I'm actually Jesus' younger brother. God is my father, and my older brother and my father tasked me with the job of cleansing China from all the demons, which means I have to overthrow the Manchu dynasty. And when you hear it like that, it's like crazy guy screaming on the corner kind of thing. Except the weird part is that through a series of random events, he starts amassing a humongous army of followers around him. And, by the time he has 1 million people with him, he's a huge force that just will start the civil war in China that continues for well over a decade. It's like, how the story of like Jim Jones, the guy who led the cult in who ended up all the people who died in Guyana and the famous. Imagine Jim Jones with an army of 1 million people. That's the Taiping Rebellion in short.
Well, now I've got another series to listen to because I didn't know that at all. I didn't know that's how that started, even a little. That is friggin' crazy.
And that's anyway. I was going to say that the episodes you were looking for initially are 45 and 46.
That's the other ones, 45 and 46. And now, like you said, the Taiping Rebellion, I saw you re-release those, and I hadn't got around to listen to them yet. And I was like, I've heard that name. I didn't really know much about it. Now I'm going to have to listen to that because that is amazing. History's crazy. You can't write this stuff. It's so much crazier than fiction.
Well, look at Lenin. Lenin had not the same story, but a similar story.
Well, they killed my brother. I'm going to tear down this whole government. And then he freaking did it.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy, too. Yeah, history's fascinating. All right, Scott, you got any more questions?
No, I think I'm all set. I think I'm good. Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah. Well, anything else you want to talk about, Mr. I was going to call you Mr. Bolelli, but he said we could call him Daniele. So anything else you want to talk about, Daniele?
No, I think I'm good. I enjoy the thing for me is like I never finish. History is so full of great stories that I don't see myself running out anytime soon. As long as I have an audience, I'll keep researching and cranking out episodes because I run into great stories constantly, even some I didn't know about, even some where I go, even something like what I mentioned, the Taiping. Even for me, I kind of vaguely knew, the Wikipedia version of the story at best. And then, after I hear it enough times, I'm like, oh, there is something there. Let me read into it. And then you find out this whole crazy tale. It's like, oh, now I need to know about it. So let me read whatever book I can get on it and then put it to. So I enjoy doing what I do.
Yeah.
I'm having fun with it. I'm experimenting with things. So as you mentioned earlier, I started recently a YouTube channel where I do kind of the opposite of what I normally do, where I go in these big 2-hour stories on the podcast. On YouTube, I do like 5, 10, 15-minute videos kind of thing, much shorter, quick, get in and get out, tell a story. I started playing, I do a Substack where I get to write essays, or sometimes I link the YouTube videos, but I'm trying to find other ways to tell stories. Basically, the podcast, I love it. And I like to branch from there to doing more videos and YouTube and more writing and Substack and, things like that. So
Right.
overall, I'm having fun with it.
Why not, right? That's great. Actually, shoot, I was just going to say something and then it popped out of my mind. That is, well, I can't remember what I was going to say, but thank you for coming on today. We really appreciate it, Daniele. This was a lot of fun. I'm going to put a link in the description to your Substack, your YouTube channel, and your podcast. People check it out. History on Fire. It's great. And apparently you can learn all about a crazy guy who just decides he's Jesus's brother and destroys 20 million people. And I didn't even know that happened
until just
now. That's okay. Oh, I remember what I was going to say, though. So Dan shared this article on his Twitter page that they are using this new technology to read ancient scrolls from Pompeii that were all cooked together. So think about that. Like history, right? You said you were always finding stories. Well, shit, dude, there might be a ton more new stories that we're about to get to find out, because that's not the only place that there's all these old scrolls they couldn't read. And if they can use technology like that, that's awesome.
Yeah.
How cool would that be?
Until they can get a machine to like dig up the ash from the Library of Alexandria. That's that.
Right. Right. Wouldn't that be cool?
Then read everything that was in there.
Well, then we just need the time travel device. Yeah.
Could you imagine what was in the Library of Alexandria?
Who knows?
I want to know.
I bet it was porn.
No,
I bet it was porn. People, a lot of that was porn. I'm telling you, that's just you. Look at the internet, right? Anything you want.
No.
90% of it, 99% of it is porn. If Library Alexandria is the ancient version of the internet, that's what it was. 100 or 99% porn, and then 1% all the other human history.
Yeah, no.
It's just that's humans.
There's no way.
I bet it was. That just occurred to me right now, and I'm now standing on that. I think that's what it was. On that note, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Daniele.
Hey, don't hang up. I got to let it upload.
Yeah.